So welcome back. I think we're doing quite well for time, so thanks again for your obedience in returning. Welcome to day one, session 3. And we will, after Renata's talk, I will introduce Renata in a moment with much anticipation. But afterwards we will have a plenary session, which is really an attempt to see if we can bring some conversation together between the 4 speakers, but even more importantly, to allow you to ask some questions about any of the talks which have happened today. So please, if you would like to prepare questions or think about those questions as well for the plenary session, which will start around 7 o'clock, and we'll have about an hour for that as well. So we want to refer back to everything that's happened today. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Renata Salecl, who is a researcher, writer and professor. She's currently visiting professor at the London School of Economics, and also at the Cardozo School of Law in New York, and also at Birkbeck College in London. This kind of multitasking, I guess, Renata. And is also a senior researcher and has been for some time at the Institute of Criminology in the Faculty of Law in Ljubljana. Her work focuses on bringing together law, criminology and psychoanalysis, and she is currently working on a book entitled Tyranny of Choice, which analyses why the late capitalist insistence on choice increases feelings of anxiety and guilt. In addition to regularly contributing to a number of scholarly journals, her publications include The Anxiety of Love Letters in Lacan and Contemporary Film and On Anxiety, both from 2004. Renata Salecl works and lives in London and Ljubljana, and her talk today is entitled Death of Money, Anxiety in Late Capitalism. Thank you, Renata.
Thank you very much, Maria and Charles, for the invitation. When I first saw this room, I remembered Russian churches which were turned into sort of kind of party headquarters. And I just thought like an image of Lenin is missing here. Otherwise, it looks kind of similar with the red color. Now, Walter Benjamin... It's true. It is a church. So there are many kind of incarnations of religion today. And Walter Benjamin already in his time reflected that capitalism functions as some kind of a religion, where market is the new God, and those who do not believe in this new God are quickly called heretics. Now, Benjamin also predicted that capitalism increases people's worries, that they escalate with the development of capitalism. I think he was right with both these 2 points. In my talk, I will reflect on what has been changing now after we have all embraced capitalism in the East and in the West. Now, a couple of years ago, I traveled in Lithuania, and when I gave a lecture there, I realized that a group of organizers who were wonderfully taking care of me were all women, a group of very talented women who each had a couple of jobs, teaching, researching, and usually earning money by translating something for some companies on the side. And I asked them after some time, why are there no men? Where are Lithuanian men? And they said to me, you know what, we really have a problem with choice now that capitalism came to us. Men decided to make a choice of another career because academia is kind of pointless. You don't earn any money there. So it's only women who still kind of do academia and organize lectures. And they also said, and they also sort of usually exchanged old wives for new, since their idea of making an ideal choice and always choosing something for something else, replacing old for new, old car for a new car, for example, was something they very much embraced. And those women said, you know what, we don't really know how to deal with choice. And Americans know how to deal with it because they have been sort of born into this ideology, and we, post-socialists, have to learn it anew. Now, of course, if you ask Americans, they will say they don't know what to do with it at all. Now, when I reflected on these dilemmas, I started, realizing that ideology all around us is convincing us that we are some kind of self-makers, that we can make out of ourselves a work of art. And when traveling around, I started sort of noticing that pretty much every country that I visited uses the same kind of logos in advertising. The usual logo is "Be Yourself." A beer company, for example, uses that logo. A Vodafone somewhere in some country uses it. It's your voice, your choice, your chase is something that a bank in America says. Be Yourself is pretty much, again, everywhere. All kinds of things. Life Book Now is a travel company in London. I almost booked it, but changed myself. And when I was just 3 days ago in St. Petersburg, I asked people, what are you reading nowadays? What's the new theory and what's happening in philosophy, art, and so on? And my host said, sadly, people are reading Cosmopolitan everywhere. This is like absolutely the best-selling thing, sometimes also Vogue. Now, in one of the issues of Cosmopolitan, not long ago, I saw the title on the cover, "Become Yourself, Only a Better One." Now, since I work in the domain of bringing ideology together with psychoanalysis, of course, immediately my clickers went up and I started feeling this is really introducing the feeling of guilt, insecurity, and anxiety when you have to become yourself and a better one. Now, a lot of my friends who are psychoanalysts are observing quite a change in the way people come to their offices and what kind of symptoms they present. A lot of people come to analysis with the demand, I need to reinvent myself. A lot of people also come with the list of things they should have achieved by year, 35. They should have been married. Usually they need to lose at least 10 kilos. The question whether to have children or not is extremely anxiety-provoking, and the whole direction of one's career. People are constantly feeling that they are a failure, that they are failing in becoming that ideal self they are so encouraged to become by today's consumer society. Now, Jacques Lacan in 1971 gave a lecture in Milan where he was sort of thinking, what is with capitalism? What kinds of suffering capitalism produces? And he gave quite a pessimistic talk. His idea was that capitalism is a system which starts going quicker and quicker. I think he was right there. People start working more and more. That's true too. And then he said people at some point are addressed to as free consumers. So he even said that proletarians suddenly become sort of called into perceiving themselves as being totally free consumers who can actually be masters of their life. Now, the pessimistic conclusion of Lacan was that capitalism also slowly, with this speeding up, produces a situation when a person starts sort of consuming him or herself. Anorexia, bulimia, various forms of self-tortures are on the rise today, and they have been for quite some time. So obviously, the feeling of guilt, anxiety, the insecurity, and various forms of self-harm are part of today's suffering. Now, capitalism also encourages a person that he can push the limits of his or her enjoyment. Whichever cosmopolitan you will look at, you will see a huge kind of article usually about how to increase your sexual satisfaction, how to master new techniques, and quite often sort of various forms of transgressions, even something that might be called a perverse transgression, is now fashioned as a new vogue. Now, a British author in one newspaper once recently commented that he's quite ashamed to admit to his friends that his sexual life is rather boring. Because, from these newspapers you have the impression that you should be doing something, about improving it. So if in Victorian times, sex was taboo, now boring sex life is taboo. One sort of keeps it to oneself. So what has changed in today's society? Some psychoanalytic theorists have for some time debated that something has changed in the organization of what Jacques Lacan has called the big other. Now, the big other would be the social symbolic structure in which we are born. That would consist of institutions, rituals, and especially language. Now, Lacan's major point about the big other is that big other doesn't exist, but it nonetheless functions. What does this mean? Big other doesn't exist as a coherent, symbolic whole. It is always a person, a society, which creates a fantasy of its consistency. And often, when one form of big other collapses, one kind of a social space in which we were born, we are very quick to invent a new one. That happened, for example, with the collapse of communism, where we could observe with some countries cutting out from their flags the star, but they couldn't for long live with the hole in the star. They very quickly searched in their history for some new symbol to put in there into this symbolic insignia. And as we heard today, they created a new history. They started digging stories about their glorious past, quite often inventing, in a way, new history, in order to create a new fantasy of consistency. So, a certain debate has been going on for some time now, in especially French philosophical and psychoanalytic circles, that the big other, as we have known it, doesn't exist anymore, that the social prohibitions that we usually internalize through the process of socialization, usually through parents know, through various authorities, teachers, religious leaders, and so on, do not exist anymore, that they have quite often been replaced by new type of authorities, like, for example, scientific committees, and that there had been quite a change in the way people sort of obey social prohibitions, or that they don't anymore actually internalize them at all. That would be the most pessimistic view. Now, an example of that, of course, can be a student of mine at LSE. I was not long ago teaching a master class in law department, and a lawyer was saying to me that he feels that in capitalism he's a totally free person. So I said, okay, explain. And he said, in the morning when I put on a suit and I go to law office, I come to a park, and there it's written, do not trespass. I obey. In the afternoon, when I put jeans on, I go directly across this park. I behave in regard to prohibitions, in regard to what kind of a suit I'm wearing. I'm a free person to obey or not obey. And then he said, in the evening, I sit in front of the computer, and I'm totally free to imagine which identity I would sort of enjoy taking on. So I pretend to be Muslim fundamentalist, and I go into internet and chit-chat with other Muslim fundamentalists. Then I pretend that I'm a woman. I'm talking, with men and women. I pretend to be gay. So his idea was that he's free to obey or not obey, and that he's in some way a true self-maker. Now, of course, I was not so quickly convinced about this, and I was sort of challenging him if he has sort of any anxiety in regard to this self-making. Obviously not. So I will sort of kind of continue with this question of what has changed for the people. Did people actually change? Did the subjectivity in capitalism in some way radically change or not? Now, some pessimistic psychoanalysts who are thinking about radical changes in the big other are claiming that today's society is actually producing more psychotics than neurotics. Now, neurotics quite often have a lot of problems with authorities. They complain that the boss is not the right boss, the husband is not the right one, the president not, and quite often they present themselves as the object that can complement the other. My husband is successful only because I'm behind him, and my boss would not finish anything if I were not there, and so on. Quite often, psychotics don't have those questions. Psychotics are usually people without doubt. They're people who often have, certainty in regard to how things are organized, which is why psychotics are often quite good leaders, especially political leaders or gurus, since those of us who are neurotic like to find occasionally someone who appears not to have those kind of doubts and questions. Now, the question for me, therefore, is, did capitalism actually change our subjectivity? As I said before, the ideology around us has been definitely, in a way, changing. Now, here it is important to remember the famous theorist Louis Althusser and his perception that ideology helps us to perceive society as something obvious, something almost natural, that it is necessary to go beyond this veil of obviousness in order to understand how ideology functions. So each society in some way requires an ideology which allows it a kind of a perpetuation of a particular regime. Now, from communism we know that one does not need to believe in ideology for ideology to function. In kind of critiques of ideology, often the work of a French psychoanalyst Octave Manoni was used, especially his theory about the logic of the belief in the belief. Octave Manoni asked, why do children who at some point quite quickly realize that Santa Claus doesn't exist continue going on pretending that they believe in Santa Claus? And his answer was that children do not want to offend belief of parents who believe that children believe. Now, this was a very important tool to understand how communism functioned, since in communism, and I was born there, no one believed in the regime. No one believed in the ideals of communism, especially not party apparatchiks. But this belief in the belief of someone else actually kept people quiet. As Václav Havel famously said in his story about the greengrocer, a greengrocer who, for example, doesn't believe in regime, but on the 1st of May, he puts a communist flag in the shop with the thinking, I don't believe, but it doesn't really matter to put the flag out. Exactly that's the thing that regime needs. Regime doesn't need the inner belief, it needs only the flag outside and quietness about one's disbelief in the regime. Now, such logical belief actually holds true also for today's post, let's say, industrial capitalist ideology of choice, self-making, the ideology which sort of introduces the idea that the subject is a master of his life and the subject is free to choose all the directions in his or her life, career, sexuality, sexual orientation, having children or not. Now, the ideology of freedom and choice, which is propagated by this capitalism, also relies on this belief in the belief. Most of the people don't believe in this idea of choice, but they believe that someone else believes, which sort of perpetuates the regime. Now, surprisingly, even with current economic crisis, not much has changed in regard to this belief in the possibilities and options that capitalism so much relies on. There was a moment when, for example, in the newspapers at the end of last year, one was able to observe some kind of a restraint, some kind of a caution in regard to the idea of progress. So I was looking at one issue of Financial Times, for example, and it had a lot of titles like "Payback Time is Coming," "We Need a Clean Break," "Wall Street Drowns its Sorrows," "A Sense of Irrationality," "How to Survive the End of Civilization," "Master of Balance and Harmony," and so on, "Songs of Simplicity." Those were sort of the titles from one simple issue. And then I sort of realized that suddenly also very quickly an enjoyment emerged almost that finally restraint is happening to this tyranny of choice. So New York Times had an article with the title, "How to Party Like It Is 1929. The article was an amazing thing, since a couple decided to create a party. They hired a party organizer and asked him to create a party for 6 by only spending $200. Now, they were so happy that the party was successful, and they said that sometimes restraint brings more enjoyment to people. Drinking cheap wine in times of recession is like a wonderful thing to do. Now, we have to see in this kind of mocking attempt to use the previous crisis, for today's crisis, a very interesting, important point that people, even to somehow downsize their lives, need an advisor, a party organizer, sort of, to help them how to downsize, which sort of goes together with all kinds of new authorities which are emerging, like coaches or people who can help you how to simplify your life. You have to pay them a lot. People who sort of write books, how I spent a year without spending, and or write blogs about, how they are sort of not spending or whatever. So all these are somehow, strangely enough, I would say, new authorities which are replacing the old authorities, which is why I'm not so pessimistic that the big other is collapsing, that there are no authorities anymore, but I would say that we have exchanged the traditional authorities with the new kinds which surprisingly, we appear to choose. We choose, a party organizer. We choose a coach who teaches us how to save money, and so on. Now, when thinking about why late capitalism in some way increases people's suffering, especially anxiety, the feeling of insecurity, self-torture, and so on, I was, thinking, what is so anxiety-provoking about this ideology of choice and self-making? Now, the usual research in the media about this points in a couple of directions. The first is that people feel that they need to make an ideal choice. And that's why some people are constantly changing their telephone provider, for example. They also question what will others think about their choice, which is why a friend of mine, a famous law professor, is always afraid to choose wine in the restaurant. He thinks if he chooses something too expensive, they will laugh. If he chooses something too cheap, they will laugh, others, which is why he insists to pay for whichever wine he chooses to pacify his feeling of guilt. Now, they also feel, people, that no one is in charge in society per se, which is why, for example, when they need to choose electricity provider, they feel like, shouldn't there be somewhere, an authority who would choose electricity for me? And they're thinking that actually when they're asked to make choices, that they are really not free to make them, that corporations usually already master the way they make choices. Now, in today's times, also we glorify the idea of self-fulfillment and happiness. There have been so many books written about happiness in the last years. Of course, psychoanalysis is highly skeptical about it. Jacques Lacan said we should not even think that a psychoanalyst is a happy man, and we should not sort of search for it because it brings just ills, the happiness. Now, an interesting novel was written with the title Happiness by a Canadian writer, Will Ferguson, and in this novel he actually envisions a society which becomes truly happy. Now, it happens when, by coincidence, people buy a particular self-help book. When they read the book, suddenly they change their lives. They stop going to gym, they cancel all subscriptions to various magazines, they stop buying cosmetics or expensive clothes, stop going for plastic surgery, and sooner or later they put on the office doors the title Gone Fishing. Now, when capitalists realize that all businesses are collapsing, they decide to find who is the author of this book. The idea is that it's a guru who was meditating in Himalaya, and then he came back with all this wisdom. But at the end, it's discovered that it is a poor man who just decided he needed to earn some money to pass it on to his grandson because the guy was dying. So at the end, capitalists decided that they need to convince the guy that society is collapsing and that he needs to write a sequel to the book with the title How to be Truly Miserable. As you can imagine, society starts going on. Now, if capitalism so much promotes in some way choice and happiness, but at the same time it increases anxiety, of course the question is, what are these anxieties about? Now, already the first writers about anxiety, like, for example, Kierkegaard, claimed that anxiety is linked to possibility of possibilities, and that it's actually freedom which creates anxiety. And Sartre added to this that when we are standing in front of the abyss, that what we are not anxious that we will fall down, but we are anxious actually that we have the freedom to push ourselves down. And that's anxiety-provoking. Again, anxiety has to do with the possibility of possibility, but also the possibilities to also terminate what is the most anxiety-provoking for us, our own life. Now, in the title of my talk, I mentioned, the problem of the death of money, and with this I was hinting precisely at the problems that we have nowadays with death of something we valued, so much in these last years. Now, the ideology of choice truly relied on the idea of endless progress, endless self-mastering, and there was quite a denial of death. In the previous talks, there was already mentioned that we have an ideology which creates an illusion of perpetual present, even aging, dying, or subscribing oneself into the hierarchy of generations are all somehow prohibited today. We have to work against aging. Mothers try to look the same like daughters, so no generational difference should be visible. So there is definitely this illusion of perpetual present, and behind it, it's quite often an anxiety over death. No matter how much we try to master death, we cannot escape it. Quite often also behind all the choices we need to make is an anxiety over loss. When I choose one direction, I'm somehow losing the possibility of going another direction. And in today's times of the idea of limitless possibility, quite often people are frozen in the moment when they cannot decide which direction to choose, precisely because ideology interpolates them as totally responsible for all the choices they are making. Now, in regard to death and dying, therefore anxiety for psychoanalysis was always crucially related, and as well with the idea of loss of life being that horrifying thing at the end. Now, in regard to today's times, I observe quite a particular denial that operates in society on a variety of levels. If we look at the attitude of consumers, we can quickly observe denials in the way they are dealing with consumption. Now, there is quite an interesting ritual to be observed, the way rich people and poor people pay with credit cards in the shops. I don't know if you ever observed, but a rich person will sort of throw a card to the salesperson as if he can't be bothered, with this stupid ritual of signing the card and paying. And the poor person will sort of give the card and kind of almost take it back, as if suddenly a moment of hesitation emerges that at some point maybe the debt will have to be paid. Now, buyers have been, by capitalist ideology, so much encouraged actually to persist in a certain denial. Denial that, in regard to spending, the ideology very much promoted sort of the hope that maybe debt never will be repaid. So, in some way, people quickly bought into something what was presented to them by the consumer society. Now, this tendency to forestall the confrontation with debt became the basis of consumption and the organization of quite a lot of businesses which were leading up to financial crisis. Buy something today, pay later was the motto of it all. Now, when consumers were sort of shuffling their credit cards and they were putting off the final paying of the debt, we can say financial institutions promoted the fantasy that the payday would not come. Also, they were also somehow in the fantasy going on from one investment into a hedge fund to another. Now, during these years, we had another sort of example of Octave Manoni's thinking about how people reasoning, and that was following his idea that quite often people reason in the way, I know very well, but. And that but is a moment of denial. Although I know there is this but where usually I put, and I try to somehow deny what I was sort of knowing before. Now, Lacan also pointed out that in a way people have no passion to really know, and he said that actually we don't see a passion for knowledge, we actually see passion for ignorance. which is why denial could be quite a useful thing when we are ill. Denying illness is something that might actually help us to survive, or denying death can be something actually that appeases our anxiety in our old age, which is why some writers even link dementia as a kind of a helpful mechanism that not only we are forgetting the past, when we are demented, we also forget the future. And the future in this case is death. Now, with willful forgetfulness in regard to money, we can see that there is a similarity with this idea of death. Now, reporting on the collapse of the stock markets, New York Times in one issue investigated high levels of depression in the retirement communities, especially in Florida, where people were deeply troubled by the losses in the stock market. Some psychologists who worked in this community observed that this depression was so present that people sort of behaved as if someone died. And one psychotherapist who helped those mourners said that they indeed were dealing with death. She said their money died. Now, how can we understand this idea that there is a link between death and economic loss? Now, often we save money in order to cheat death, to live on through our inheritance, for example, especially when we write a will. We often want, through the fights that our children will have over the will, to sort of live longer in their mind, to keep ourselves symbolically alive after we are gone. Often money is taken as a blanket against decay, as a kind of a safe haven if we get ill, protection against solitude, illness, and so on. And at some time, we also take special enjoyment in spending money freely, throwing it away, which is why in psychoanalytic terms, money is often related as one version of shit, as something that is linked to an anal character of a person. A sublime shit one is both fascinated and horrified by. How else can we understand great pleasures which people have when they are sort of spending a lot of money that they don't have, or especially when they are gambling or buying things they don't need? Now, American psychologists who researched the attitude of gamblers found out that quite a lot of gamblers are also depressed. The research was done in Las Vegas casinos, and they realized that a lot of people who come there have been for the whole year saving money just to come there to throw it away. They were usually buying very cheap things, driving long hours to get some savings, working long hours to have money and so on. So the whole year they were frugal, and the moment it appeared in Las Vegas, where all this money was, there was an enjoyment in purging in. At the end of the day, however, these people resumed their frugal habits. They went into the cheapest restaurants where they can eat all-you-can-eat buffet for $5. They rationally also knew that at the end, casino wins. So such games, in a way, with money, which go from saving to purging, show the uncanny character that we attribute to it. Money is obviously dead, but at the same time, it looks that we have to constantly kill it again and again, since we are so uncertain about its power. Now, it is as if throwing it away alleviates the anxiety that money provokes. Yet the feeling of guilt quickly comes in, which is why we start obsessively saving money after we have thrown it away. Now, in the last decades, corporations have often behaved in this way. And also they have found various enjoyments in denial. Once I was invited to give a talk for the CEOs of a large corporation of East European phone companies. Not that I know anything about them, but they wanted a psychoanalytic take on why people use mobile phones, and I was quite intrigued by this. Now, the organizers, however, asked me to speak positively. They told me, CEOs cannot deal with pessimistic lecture. I have never been asked that, but I tried my best. And then when I listened to some of the CEOs, I thought that they were absolutely optimistic. And all their charts were showing that 2015, they will overtake all the competition. Their shares will go up. Their psychologists who gave the speech were talking about everyone can become a leader and so on. I felt like I'm in a church. Denial was present everywhere. Leaders of the corporation were avoiding themes that might shatter their optimistic stance. They perceived the future as rosy, and the participants were basking in self-congratulation, feeling of success. They showed no doubt about the future. They only perceived everything as controllable, predictable, no risk, no uncertainty. Everything was as they wished to be seen. Now, clearly, our generation of capitalism has thrived on the illusion of progress, while privately the idea of ever-expanding possibilities only made us more anxious. The more we tried to convince ourselves that we have limitless choices, the more we became actually anxious and dissatisfied and quite guilt-ridden. Nowadays, for example, if you lose your job, it is your guilt, and you are not blaming any more a corporation, for example, to lay you off. You blame yourself for not searching for another job before. Now, before I mentioned this idea that psychoanalysts have been debating whether a person have become, in a way, more psychotic, and that people actually have less doubt, and that they are actually more prone to some kind of illusions in regard to themselves. Recently, a lot of interest in the psychoanalytic community has been in rediscovering Helen Deutsch's, she was a post-Freudian, work on the so-called as-if personality. Now, Helen Deutsch perceived as-if personality as personality who is prone to imitation of others and strong identification. And as-if personality, in her opinion, was also a personality where you can say that a person might have a psychotic structure, but the person does not show overt signs of psychosis, so you don't see outside signs of delusion, paranoia, and so on. A person functions perfectly. Now, a friend of mine, a French psychoanalyst, explained an example of such a patient. He had a guy in therapy who at first entered law school because his best friend went to law school. He became a successful lawyer. After, in the port of Marseille, he met a sailor, he became a sailor. After, in another port, he met a businessman, he became a successful businessman. He married, and the wife told him he should go to analysis. He obeyed. When the analyst asked him, "Why did you come?" he said, "My wife told me to come." He became a successful patient. Now, what was so intriguing about this person is that he had no uncertainty, no anxiety, no doubts in regard to all the changes he had made in his life. He was prone to imitate someone else, very strongly identifying, and through this identification, sort of functioning perfectly. But questions did not exist for him. He did not have those uncertainties as a neurotic would have, who would need to endlessly ponder about the change in the career. Now, I'm not so pessimistic that today's society is turning people into those kind of psychotics. My idea is that actually the big other still very much functions, that we still very much create authorities, and that still we feel a lot of feelings of guilt, doubt, and anxiety, although quite often in a new way, related to the ideology which I described earlier. How does the big other function today? Now, when I read about women in New York who ran huge debts on credit card in New York Times, I surprisingly found what kind of a solution they have created for themselves. A number of women created blogs on which they daily describe their spending habits, and they daily sort of describes their attempt to pay off debt. One woman said that in the evening when she sits in front of the computer, she feels terribly guilty if she had spent some money for useless things. Now, it is she who created the blog. It was not imposed on her. But once she created this blog, suddenly it appeared as if the blog was an authority in front of which she felt guilty. So she created a kind of a version of an authority and placed it in the new big other, like the internet, and that functioned as often the old authorities. Now, quite often, when we place something that we created into the hands of the other, we feel with this kind of feeling of anxiety and guilt. An example of this is a Slovenian philosophy professor who decided not to be bothered by asking students questions and ask students to create their own questions for exam, write it on a piece of paper and give it to him before the exam. As soon as a student presented the paper, professor read the question, almost all students behaved in the same way. Oh my God, this is exactly the question I don't know. Or, how could you ask me this? We did not take this in the class. One student claimed that this is outrageous that a professor can ask such a question. And in some way, here too, we see how we can create our own sort of illusions that, the tasks are coming from somewhere else. In conclusion, let me tackle an issue of what I also think is bothering us in late capitalism, and that would be the feeling of shame. My idea is that capitalism does not only increase our feeling of guilt, but incredibly increases our feeling of shame. Nowadays, we often feel ashamed if we are poor, or ashamed if we are old, ashamed if we are fat, ashamed if we are not working on our body, our children, and so on. For example, even organizing a funeral ritual can be quite a moment of encountering shame. In Slovenia, when capitalism came, for example, funeral rituals became a shopping experience. You have to buy a coffin which will be very quickly burned, if you are cremating, but you have to decide which type of coffin, and you are feeling absolutely ashamed in front of the person who is selling you, as if you are kind of cheap and don't want to invest in this coffin. Then you have to spend a lot of money, or at least ponder whether to spend money on the casket, which will be sort of buried down somewhere, so no one will see it. In addition, you have to decide about flowers and everything. So quite often people come out of this experience with a terrible feeling of shame in front of some kind of a gaze. Now, quite often when we are ashamed, we downcast our eyes, we look down. But what is it? Why do we do this? What we don't want to see? And what is it that we are hiding from? Now, quite often in shame, we experience some kind of a feeling that another might see us. Now, in guilt, however, when we are feeling guilty, we feel that we can, in a way, somehow repay this debt to the other, that we can somehow maybe pay and feel and, sort of put things back into order. With shame, however, the problem is that quite often when we put the eyes down, we also don't want to really see that there is, no big other. We sort of avert the gaze from seeing, for example, that authority is actually marked by inconsistency when we are ashamed in front of the Father. It's not simply that we don't want to be seen, but we also don't want to see the Father in his pain, for example, or when we are in shame in front of other authorities, we don't want to see, in a way, the fact that authorities themselves are powerless. So shame, in some way, opens up the fact that one experiences oneself as visible, but there is no external other really to see, since shame is somehow the proof that the other doesn't exist. Now, today's society strangely wants to increase shame. A British judiciary system has been thinking whether prisoners who are working outside should have some marks so that they would feel ashamed. Of course, this reminds us, unfortunately, on some other people who in the past had those ideas that people should have marks and be seen. And Chinese, of course, are playing on the shame a lot when they are punishing people. So if one gets death sentence in China, his family has to pay for the bullet in order, to kind of deal with shame. Now, in capitalism today, this feeling of shame goes together with the feelings of anxiety and the feeling that we are constantly failing in making out of ourselves a work of art or an ideal life. My conclusion is that capitalism with this ideology actually averts the gaze from itself, from the system as such. The more and more we feel ashamed for our failures, the more and more we focus on ourselves, the more and more we are anxious that we didn't do the most for our happiness, our successes, the less we open up our eyes to observe what is happening in society, and the less we are also opening the possibility for a critique of society. So in today's society, we are critiquing ourselves and not critiquing society. And that, I think, has been an enormous change from the past. Change which actually does not allow for a lot of social changes. Now, in conclusion, let me go back to death of money. Now, when we are debating where we are heading with our society, and when we are sort of thinking about choice and, especially the choice over what kind of organization of society we might envision in the past, when we are sort of thinking whether this crisis, for example, will open up a possibility to rethink the system, to rethink also whether there are alternatives to this organization of society, whether there are alternatives to capitalism as we know it. The question emerges whether the current crisis will actually go beyond the denial I was talking about. My pessimism here is quite high with the recent development. I feel that more and more we are again basking in the denial about where society is heading, and that we are just trying to fix the minor problems that existed in the financial system. So if money has been in some way fantasized or hyped as a kind of a phantasmatic entity that was supposed to be endlessly growing in the space of financial institutions in the last years, and if for the moment it looked that this money might have actually died, I wonder if something new might come out of this loss. Will there be a repetition of the same? That's sort of my question. Will we quickly go back to denial? Or will the death of something that was already dead provide an opening for the more of the vampire-like figures who were always living dead, that were sucking blood, from the population? Will there be an opportunity that we will quickly mourn, that we will somehow be able to go over the fantasy which we created, fantasy about the endless progress? And will we become more humble in regard to our future? Now, any death, even if it's death of fantasy, burdens us with responsibility. This is responsibility not only to others, but responsibility to ourselves, to rethink our own involvement in the fantasy we created and the perpetuation of the fantasy. But any idea of choice that I was talking about somehow always opens also the possibility of change. So even if we stay with the idea that quite often choice is an illusion, nonetheless in political space we have to say that choice opens the space for change. Richard Kapuscinski wrote about the end of the Shah regime in 1979 in Iran by pointing out that probably one can envision that it was one person on the street at some moment when a policeman asked him to stop who didn't obey, and many others followed. We saw the same with the fall of communism, especially in the Romanian regime. It was as if that moment appeared when no one was applauding anymore Ceausescu, and as we know, he didn't realize that he was dead even before he actually died. Now, these changes are very important, and they cannot be predicted, they cannot be rationally controlled. I never thought that the end of a Berlin Wall will happen in my life. I truly never envisioned, and most of my colleagues in former Yugoslavia never thought that communism will come to an end. It was a surprise for all of us. Now, while ideology today teaches us that we can rationally control the future, that we can prevent risk, that we can sort of avoid uncertainty, when rational choice actually is everywhere dominated as the main ideology, in some way, of course, we try to make life predictable and we try to annihilate risks. But the reality is that choice always, in a way, precisely opens the moment of unpredictable. It opens the doors for possible regret of what might have been, but it opens also the possibility, the window of hope, and of course, anxiety that comes with it. Thank you.